You ever watch a fight and just sit there rethinking all that you know about MMA? That's what this list is all about. Those times when a champion walked in looking unbeatable, only to get absolutely demolished. Whether it was a brutal knockout, a 5-round beatdown, or a champ just getting completely outclassed, these were the fights that left the fans speechless. These are 10 UFC champions that shockingly got destroyed. Jon Jones was one of those guys where even early in his career, people could tell he was special. He had that unorthodox style, that ridiculous reach, and just seemed to be ahead of everyone skill-wise. But at the time, he was still seen as a prospect. A really good one, sure, but he hadn't faced anyone at the level of Shogun. Shogun had finally reached the top of the light heavyweight division after years of being considered one of the best. He had knocked out Lyoto Machida to win the belt and was a dangerous, well-rounded fighter with a ton of experience. People figured he'd at least give Jones a tough fight, maybe even teach him a lesson. Instead, Jones walked in there and put on one of the most dominant performances in UFC title fight history. From the opening bell, Shogun had no space to work. Jones pressured him, took him down, hit him with nasty elbows, and just never let up. By the third round, Shogun was exhausted and beaten up, and when Jones landed a body shot that crumpled him, that was it. The ref stepped in and a new era had officially started. It wasn't just a win, it was the moment that let everyone know that Jon Jones was next in line. Junior Dos Santos was on top of the world. When he first fought Cain Velasquez, it took him less than a minute to land the perfect overhand right and put Cain out cold. It was the fastest title fight in UFC history at the time, and it seemed like Dos Santos was ready to reign for a long time. But Cain? He wasn't just going to let that loss define him. The rematch came, and from the opening bell, it was clear that this wasn't the same fight. Cain didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the perfect shot. He charged forward, took Dos Santos down, and started what would become one of the most brutal 5-round beatings in UFC history. By the second round, Junior's face was unrecognizable. He was exhausted, battered, and looked completely lost. The next 3 rounds weren't any better. Cain kept the pressure on, never giving him a second to breathe, and by the time the final horn sounded, it felt like a miracle that Dos Santos was still standing. This wasn't just a loss, it was a complete dismantling, a revenge tour where Cain proved that no 2 fights are the same. Ronda Rousey was, at one point, the biggest star in MMA. She was winning all of her fights in the first round, tossing people around like nothing, and submitting them in seconds. She looked unstoppable. Holly Holm, on the other hand, was a decorated boxer, but in MMA, she hadn't really impressed anyone yet. Most people thought Ronda would just take her down and armbar her like she did with everyone else. But Holm had a different plan. From the start, Rousey looked out of her element. Holm was keeping her at range, landing clean shots and stuffing takedowns. As the fight went on, you could see Rousey getting frustrated. She wasn't used to this. Then, in the second round, Holm landed the kick that would change everything. A perfectly timed head kick sent Rousey crashing to the mat, and that was it. It wasn't just that Ronda lost, it was how completely outclassed she looked. She was the face of women's MMA, the undefeated champion who was supposed to be unbeatable. And yet that night, she had no answers. After that, Rousey fought once more, got finished again, and never returned to MMA. It was one of the biggest turning points in UFC history.
I think I'd just rather not talk about that right now.
Jessica Andrade was the definition of brute force. If you watched her fight, you saw someone who didn't just win, she crushed people. She slammed Thug Rose onto her neck to win the title. She bulldozed through anyone who stood in front of her, and heading into her first title defense, she was considered an absolute wrecking ball. Then came Zhang Weili, a fighter with talent, but not much hype. Sure, she had a couple of impressive wins, but Andrade was supposed to be too much for her. After all, Zhang wasn't a power puncher, and she wasn't some grappling phenom. She was just solid. No one expected what happened next. From the opening bell, Zhang blitzed Andrade with a flurry of strikes that left the champion completely defenseless. It wasn't just a quick knockout, it was a complete obliteration. Andrade had no answers. She was stunned, then dropped, then pounded into the canvas in under a minute. The fight wasn't competitive for a second. Zhang Weili didn't just beat her, she took everything Andrade was supposed to be and flipped it on its head. This one might be the most famous example of a champion getting wiped out in shocking fashion. Jose Aldo had been the featherweight king for years. He was undefeated for a decade, had defended his belt multiple times, and was widely considered one of the best fighters in the world. Meanwhile, Conor McGregor had been talking a big game, but a lot of people weren't sure if he could actually back it up. Yeah, he looked great against other contenders, but Aldo was another level. Then the fight started. Aldo came rushing in, McGregor landed one perfectly timed left hand, and boom, 13 seconds in, it was over. That was it. The greatest featherweight of all time had just been knocked out with the first real punch thrown. People were in disbelief. You could see it in the crowd, in the reactions of the commentators. No one could believe what they had just seen. It was one of those moments where time almost stops because something that was supposed to be impossible just happened right in front of you. At the time, Renan Barao was on one of the craziest unbeaten streaks in MMA history. He hadn't lost in almost a decade, and he was tearing through the bantamweight division. People were already talking about him as one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. TJ Dillashaw, on the other hand, wasn't even supposed to be in this fight. He wasn't the original challenger, and while he was solid, nobody saw him as the guy to dethrone Barao. But from the first round, Dillashaw made it clear this wasn't going to be the one-sided fight people expected. He was faster, his movement was sharp, and he was landing clean shots. Barao, who usually overwhelmed his opponents, just couldn't keep up, and it didn't get better as the fight went on. If anything, it got worse. TJ just picked him apart round after round until the 5th, when he finally put him away with a head kick and punches. It wasn't just an upset, it was a completely one-sided beatdown. Nobody saw Barao getting dominated like that, and after that loss, he was never really the same again. It was one of those moments where the entire landscape of a division changes overnight. Rich Franklin was the kind of guy everyone respected, smart, well-rounded, and hard-working. He wasn't flashy, but he was effective, and it felt like he was going to be the middleweight champ for a long time, until Anderson Silva came along. Anderson had already made a statement in his UFC debut by knocking out Cris, but Franklin was a different challenge. He was the champ, he had good striking, and he had never really been dominated before. Turns out it didn't matter. Anderson came in and put on one of the most one-sided performances in title fight history. He got Franklin in the clinch, and that was the beginning of the end. Every time Franklin tried to move, Anderson was landing brutal knees to the body and head. By the time it was over, Franklin looked completely out of it. He was dazed, bloody, and had just lost his belt in one of the most lopsided fights ever. People thought maybe Franklin just had a bad night, so they ran it back, and Anderson did it again. After that, everyone realized the same thing. Anderson Silva wasn't just another champion. He was about to be one of the greatest fighters of all time. At the time, Joanna was the dominant force in the strawweight division. She talked trash, she backed it up, and she had already defended her belt 5 times. She was fast, aggressive, and just overwhelmed people with volume striking. Rose, on the other hand, wasn't really seen as a knockout artist. She had skills, no doubt, but most people expected Joanna to just be too much for her. Then the fight started, and Rose came out looking sharper than ever. She was landing clean shots early, and you could see Joanna struggling to find her rhythm. Then, out of nowhere, Thug Rose landed a perfect left hook, and Joanna went down hard. She got back up, but Rose stayed calm, kept landing, and dropped her again. That was it, and new. A lot of people thought it was a fluke, but then they ran it back, and Rose beat her again, this time by decision. That first fight wasn't a lucky punch. It was a UFC star being born. Cris Cyborg was, without a doubt, the most feared woman in MMA for over a decade. She wasn't just winning, she was destroying people. The idea of her losing, let alone getting finished, just didn't seem realistic at the time. But Amanda Nunes had been quietly building up her own legacy. She had already knocked out Ronda Rousey and Miesha Tate, and she hit harder than most people realized. Still, most thought Cyborg would be too big, too strong, and too durable. Then the fight started, and within seconds, it turned into an all-out brawl. But instead of Cyborg overwhelming Nunes, it was the other way around. Amanda was landing first and landing clean. You could see Cyborg wasn't used to being in trouble. She kept swinging, but she was getting tagged over and over. And then just like that, she was out. A first-round knockout. Cyborg, the fighter nobody thought could be beaten like that, was finished in under a minute. That fight changed the conversation. Before, Cyborg was the most feared striker in women's MMA, but after that, the Amanda Nunes era began. Robert Whittaker had already proven he could survive wars. He went through hell against Yoel Romero twice. He had one of the toughest chins in the sport, relentless cardio, and the ability to push through deep waters against the scariest middleweights on the planet. Israel Adesanya, on the other hand, was still untested in a lot of people's eyes. Sure, he was flashy and he was undefeated, but was he really ready for Bobby Knuckles? The answer came quickly. Whittaker came out aggressive, trying to put the pressure on Adesanya, but Izzy was completely unfazed. He moved, he countered, and he made Whittaker look like he was fighting in slow motion. The first round ended with Adesanya landing a knockdown, a sign of what was coming. Then, early in the second, he landed a perfect counter that sent Whittaker crashing to the canvas. That was it. The fight was over. Whittaker, who had never been outclassed before, looked like he didn't belong in there. It wasn't just that Adesanya won, it was how easy he made it look. So yeah, MMA is wild and unpredictable. Sometimes you're the hammer, and sometimes you're the nail. It just goes to show that in this sport, nobody is safe, no matter how dominant they may seem. But hey, that's part of what makes MMA so exciting. You never really know what's gonna happen. So which of these fights shocked you the most? Or is there another championship beatdown that should have made the list? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.